The kitchen smells like wood smoke, rot, and something you're not sure was ever meant to be food. A cauldron bubbles in the corner, but what's inside isn't stew, it's survival. Welcome to the Dark Ages, where recipe meant whatever didn't kill you last week. Forget olive oil and pink Himalayan salt. People here were cooking with blood, ashes, and the occasional handful of dirt for flavor. Butter was a luxury, rats were protein, and spices were more valuable than your entire house. You'd think hunger might inspire creativity. It did, just not the kind you'd want to taste. When crops failed, when winters froze, and when superstition ran hotter than any stove, the human menu took a turn straight into nightmare territory. And the worst part? They liked it. So, grab your appetite or lose it fast, because tonight's dinner is straight from the Dark Ages. Ashes, dirt, and desperation. The medieval kitchen wasn't a place for flavor. It was a laboratory of survival, equal parts desperation, smoke, and bad decisions. When the spice trade collapsed and salt became more expensive than gold, cooks turned to whatever lay underfoot. Ashes weren't trash, they were seasoning. Dirt wasn't waste, it was filler. Every handful of soot, bark, or crushed bone added weight to a loaf that needed to look bigger than it actually was. Peasant bread often came out gray, cracked, and full of grit that could grind teeth down like sandpaper. Excavations across Europe have uncovered ancient loaves laced with minerals, ground bark, and even pulverized clay. To call it bread is generous, it was more like baked desperation. Still, people ate it, because the alternative was hunger gnawing from the inside out. When harvests failed, creativity replaced nutrition. The idea of adding flavor meant neutralizing bitterness, not enhancing taste. Even insects sometimes found their way into the dough, half on purpose, half by accident. The smell of these makeshift meals filled homes with a strange, earthy odor, not unpleasant, but not quite appetizing either. Today's chefs talk about farm to table. Back then, it was field to mouth to grave. Every crumb carried a reminder of just how fragile life was. And if it didn't kill, it kept working-class bodies upright for another day in the mud. The irony? Nobles used similar ashes for whitening their faces and cleaning their clothes, while peasants mixed them into bread. One class purified, the other consumed. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get more humiliating for the medieval appetite, they did, because sometimes even the simplest meal turned out to be the deadliest one on the table. When bread wanted you dead, bread was Europe's heartbeat, baked daily, eaten by everyone, trusted without question. But in the Dark Ages, that trust came with a lethal catch. Rye grain, when stored in damp barns, grew a parasitic fungus called ergot, the same toxin that centuries later would be refined into LSD. When ingested, it didn't spark creativity or enlightenment. It sparked agony. Fingers blackened, limbs rotted, and hallucinations turned villages into scenes of chaos. Chroniclers described peasants screaming that demons were clawing through their flesh. Entire towns writhed in shared hallucinations, their skin erupting in blisters. The church called it divine punishment. Science, much later, called it poisoning. The condition became infamous as Saint Anthony's fire. The victims convulsed, danced, and burned from the inside out. It hit hardest during wet summers and poor harvests, when families couldn't afford to throw away moldy grain. They ground it, baked it, and prayed. The smell of fresh bread masked the danger within, and yet, the strange part is that they kept eating it. Bread wasn't just food, it was identity. To stop baking was to stop existing. Monks wrote of entire communities falling into fits of delirium, seeing angels, and confessing sins that made no sense. Some historians even suspect that certain witchcraft panics were triggered by ergot-laced bread, causing mass hallucinations. But superstition dies hard. To peasants, it wasn't fungus. It was punishment. To priests, it was proof of sin. And to the hungry, it was dinner. So they kept baking. Every loaf was a gamble: salvation or suffering, nourishment or nightmare. And when the fever broke, those who survived would swear never to eat cursed bread again. They lied. Because next season, when the grain bins filled with damp rye once more, so did the ovens. And worse still, the madness of hunger didn't stop at bread. When flour ran out entirely, people started boiling whatever they could find, even if it belonged in the dirt, not the pot. Soup of Ray. The phrase soup of the day once meant survival stew, a bubbling confession of everything wrong with the world. In famine years, the pot became both a lifeline and grave marker. Its contents changed daily, depending on what could be scavenged, stolen, or scraped from the ground. Grass went in first, weeds followed, roots, bark, and sometimes shredded leather boots softened in the boiling water. Chroniclers in France and England describe peasants eating bread of bark, a term that wasn't poetic, it was literal. The outer layers of trees were ground into powder and mixed with a handful of flour to stretch out the dough. The result was gray, bitter, and barely chewable. When livestock died, the bones joined the pot. When there were no animals left, anything that moved was fair game. Rats, cats, and dogs disappeared quietly from alleys. In rare, whispered cases, famine crossed the line entirely. Human flesh appeared in village legends, the ultimate taboo born from desperation. The smell of these soups filled the air with smoke, rot, and hopelessness. It clung to clothes, to hair, to memory. Hunger changed the rhythm of communities. Markets vanished. Fields lay empty. The kitchen fire became the only thing left that still burned. Even faith trembled. Priests preached patience. Farmers stopped listening. God had gone silent, and the only answer came from a pot that hissed like guilt. Modern people talk about comfort food, the kind that warms the soul. This was the opposite. Food that reminded you your soul was still trapped inside a starving body. And yet, families gathered around it. They laughed when they could, pretended the taste didn't matter, pretended the texture wasn't mud and misery. Because pretending was easier than feeling the truth that this was what civilization had become. The soup of regret wasn't just a meal. It was a mirror. One that showed a world where hunger rewrote morality, where humanity boiled down to its barest instinct, and even that was starting to burn. The Great Butter War. Of all the battles fought in medieval Europe, none were stranger than the one over butter. It wasn't fought with swords or shields, but with spoons and sermons. The church had strict rules about when believers could eat certain foods. Meat, milk, eggs, and butter all banned during fasting days, and there were a lot of those. In some regions, nearly half the calendar year was off limits to animal products. The idea was spiritual purity. The result was culinary despair. Without butter, peasants turned to oil made from poppy seeds, walnuts, and sometimes fish. It wasn't olive oil that luxury was for the Mediterranean elite. This was cold, rancid sludge that spread like guilt on stale bread. In northern France, things reached a boiling point. The local peasants couldn't survive without dairy. Their farms depended on it. So they did what every desperate medieval society eventually did. They begged the Pope for mercy. Petitions were sent to Rome asking for butter indulgences, official permission to eat dairy during fasting. Rome, as always, found a holy compromise: forgiveness for a fee. The wealthy simply paid and spread butter freely, while the poor continued to scrape by on oily misery. Cathedrals were literally funded by butter taxes, including the famous Rouen Cathedral, whose tower was nicknamed the Butter Tower. So while nobles dined on rich creamy sauces during Lent, the villagers gagged on fish fat porridge, told to be grateful for the blessing. Religion had turned butter into a sin, then monetized forgiveness. And just when fasting seemed unbearable, along came the next course, where cooking became an experiment in madness itself. Alchemy in the kitchen. Before chemistry had rules, alchemy had imagination, and medieval cooks took that imagination straight into the kitchen. Food wasn't just meant to nourish, it was meant to dazzle. The nobility demanded meals that shimmered like treasure and glowed like gold. And that's exactly what they got, with a side of heavy metal poisoning. Cooks used pewter, copper, and lead utensils for everything. The glazes on pottery were often pure lead oxide, which leached into soups and stews like invisible death. Even sugar, when it appeared, was sometimes mixed with ground mercury to create a metallic shine. Physicians, those wise men of the age, prescribed powdered gemstones, coral dust, or crushed pearls for vital energy. Dinner, apparently, was also a medical experiment. In royal feasts, birds were roasted, painted with gold leaf, and then redressed in their own feathers for display. Guests gasped at the spectacle, a phoenix reborn through culinary sorcery. They didn't realize the glitter was killing them slowly. Alchemy blurred the line between medicine and poison, between beauty and death. Recipes read like spellbooks. Instructions called for boiling urine to clarify broth, mixing ashes for purity, and cooking with arsenic to enhance flavor. If something shimmered, it was considered sacred. But beneath the glamour, these feasts carried a silent irony. The more divine the meal looked, the more deadly it became. The wealthy quite literally consumed their own vanity. By the time the Renaissance arrived, nobles were pale, sickly, and often toothless victims of the very elegance they demanded. Alchemy promised transformation, and in a way, it delivered. It just turned life into death a little faster than expected. And if the nobles were poisoning themselves with pride, the common folk were wrestling with something far more tangible meat that refused to stay dead. Meat, but make it cursed. In the medieval world, meat was the crown jewel of any meal, and also its most dangerous secret. Without refrigeration, a slaughtered animal had hours before decay began. Flies arrived first, then maggots, then the smell, a thick, sweet rot that clung to walls and skin alike. But food waste was a luxury no one could afford, so it all went into the pot. Cooks smoked it, salted it, or soaked it in vinegar to mask the stench. Preserved was a generous term. Barely hanging on was closer to the truth. In towns, butchers worked beside sewage channels, their scraps floating down into the same rivers used for drinking water. Disease followed, though no one knew why. When sickness spread, people blamed everything but the obvious: witches, demons, and planetary misalignment, anything except bacteria. Some refused certain meats entirely, believing pigs or goats carried evil spirits. Others treated fasting as proof of holiness, boasting about their ability to resist fleshly temptation. And yet, during festivals or wars, those same believers devoured anything they could catch: horses, dogs, even carrion left on the battlefield. The line between faith and hunger blurred into hypocrisy. To make things worse, superstition dictated how meat should be cooked. Some believed roasting over oak warded off demons. Others thought sprinkling holy water on raw cuts purified them. The results varied spiritually and medically. The rich had options. They ate peacocks, swans, and venison served under layers of perfume and spice to disguise decay. The poor had none. For them, a piece of meat, however cursed, was salvation wrapped in rot. Every bite was a prayer, a gamble, and a slow education in what not to eat. Hygiene manuals didn't exist, but they didn't need to. The plague would write its own lessons soon enough, because in the medieval kitchen, even the food believed in the supernatural, and sometimes it won. Faith on a plate. In the Dark Ages, the dinner table wasn't just a place to eat, it was a negotiation with heaven. Every bite came with a moral clause. Fish meant purity, red meat hinted at sin. Eggs and butter could damn or redeem, depending on the day of the week and who was watching. Religion ran the kitchen like a celestial health inspector. Fasting wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced by law and guilt. Monks tracked calendars of abstinence, marking which foods were acceptable offerings to God and which were Satan's snacks. A single bite of forbidden bacon could stain the soul as much as theft or lust. Pilgrims carried relics on long journeys, hoping that the bones of a saint might bless their bread. Priests blessed loaves, poured holy water on wine, and performed small exorcisms before banquets. Some even believed demons could hide in food, a devil in a dumpling, a sin in a sausage. When famine struck, people didn't curse the weather. They blamed their own wickedness. Failed harvests were seen as divine punishment, not poor soil or pestilence. Churches filled with starving congregations begging forgiveness for crimes they hadn't committed while priests quietly ate from secret stores in the back room. Faith dictated flavor. Lent stripped diets of meat. Advent reduced meals to fish and vegetables, and the feasts of saints brought temporary indulgence. Every meal became a sermon on sin, salvation, and stomach cramps. And when faith and famine intertwined, it produced a special kind of madness, one where the line between devotion and delusion blurred, and where holiness could sometimes taste a lot like hunger, a taste of class. Dinner in the Middle Ages wasn't just about food, it was performance art. For nobles, feasting was proof of power, and the table was their stage. Pies were dusted with gold leaf, swans were roasted and refeathered, and jelly molds shimmered like stained glass. Every banquet was a show designed to dazzle guests and humiliate anyone who couldn't afford to play along. Wine flowed, perfume disguised the smell of decay, and servants rushed to refill trenchers' edible plates made of stale bread. The rich didn't just eat, they displayed wealth through waste. The leftovers fed dogs, servants, or no one at all. Meanwhile, peasants ate the opposite of glory. Their daily meal was pottage, a gluey mixture of oats, cabbage, and whatever scraps could be spared. It was gray, lumpy, and endlessly recycled. One pot could simmer for days, gaining flavor only from despair and smoke. The class divide was literal. The rich tasted luxury, the poor tasted survival. Yet both shared the same invisible guest bacteria. Nobles fell sick from spoiled meat drowned in spice, while peasants suffered from contaminated water and rot. The germs didn't care who wore silk or sackcloth. Even the smell of a home gave away one's rank. The aristocrats' hall reeked of meat, fat, and incense, the peasants' hut of smoke, sweat, and boiled roots. Both were reminders that status had flavor but not immunity. And just when it seemed the gap between rich and poor couldn't grow wider, one final detail united them again: the smell. The smell that never left. The scent of the Middle Ages wasn't something to imagine, it was something to survive. Smoke hung thick in the air, clinging to hair, clothes, and lungs. Every hearth burned day and night, fueled by damp wood that coughed out soot like a dying dragon. Grease from 100 meals coated the walls until kitchens glistened black. Washing was rare, ventilation non-existent. Windows were small, and chimneys were often blocked by nests or debris. The result was an aroma somewhere between a butcher's shop, a fireplace, and a battlefield. Visitors described the odor as holy rot, the perfume of faith, famine, and fried everything. In castles, the stench came from roasted meat, wine-soaked floors, and unwashed guests wearing velvet too heavy to clean. In peasant huts, it came from mud, mold, and livestock sleeping beside their owners for warmth. The smell of life and decay mingled into one continuous haze. Soap existed but was harsh and costly, made from animal fat and lye. Most people used ashes or sand to scrub, sometimes with more damage than result. And because perfume was seen as vanity, the church frowned on those who tried to mask their natural piety. The air itself told stories: which family was cooking, which village was starving, which home hid CK-ness. Even centuries later, when historians opened sealed medieval homes, the odor lingered faint but unmistakable. It was the scent of survival, of bodies and faith and fire, the scent of a world that lived closer to death than comfort. History remembers battles, kings, and miracles. But what truly defined the Dark Ages wasn't the sound of swords or the light of prayer, it was the smell, a smell that no one, not even time, could wash away. If you survived this far into the feast of horrors, you've earned your place at the table. Subscribe for more tales where history rots beautifully in the dark.